is Atari 8-Bit Podcast.
So he sat nervously with $30,000 in stack-bound $100 bills in his jacket pockets for the entire flight over from Japan.
This is Antic, the Atari 8-Bit Podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Brian Lee started at clothing retailer The Gap, where he used Atari computers for expense control and store operations. He was vice president of product development at Synapse Software from 1982 through 1985, where he managed the Syn line of business software and programmed SynTrend. Next, he was director of acquisition at Broderbund from 1984 to 1985. This interview took place on September 30th, 2016. In it, we discuss Mike Silva, whom I previously interviewed.
I got into personal computers when I was in college at Cal State Hayward, in part because they pulled the plug on the mainframe for upgrades, and I was in the middle of doing the quantitative classes for the business program. And that meant that for doing statistical analysis and forecasting, everybody had to use a calculator. And that seemed particularly inefficient. So I decided to buy a personal computer so I could write the programs to do the calculations instead of having to do them by hand with a calculator.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, I also liked to play video games. I had an Atari VCS that I actually still have. And it really kind of came down to an Apple II or an Atari computer. And I decided to get the Atari based on the availability of Star Raiders that I really liked.
Mm-hmm.
So that tilted to the scale towards the Atari. I bought it, taught myself BASIC, and wrote some statistical calculation programs to kind of get me through the classes a little bit more efficiently. And that hobby stuck with me. I started a small users group, and we would meet once a month or so and kind of take a look at what software was available and share some information about programming.
In the Bay Area, or where were you? Where was this users group?
Yes, so it was in the Bay Area, and it was just people I met at the local computer store, that sort of thing. And two of the people that were in that group were Mike Silva and Rich Tornay, both of whom eventually ended up at Synapse.
Mm-hmm.
So I graduated from Cal State Hayward and stayed on for the master's program, and eventually came out with an MBA in finance. I went to work for the Gap stores at corporate headquarters in San Bruno, and they did not have any personal computers at the time, so I was packing my Atari in a large suitcase and taking it into work each day so that I could use it to do VisiCalc and use a spreadsheet to actually do the finance work that I was hired to do. So I was budget and expense control manager in the store operations division at the Gap headquarters. So I was in charge of preparing the budgets for all of the stores and ensuring that they stayed within those budgets. So there's a lot of calculations to track current expenses and kind of allocate overhead expenses to the stores. I was largely an advocate for the store operations as opposed to being the hatchet person in the finance department. So I was kind of the hired gun to go up against finance and justify the expenses. I used the Atari. I actually deployed Atari computers out to the regional headquarters as part of the budget process. And by doing consolidations and roll-ups in VisiCalc, we were actually able to cut the amount of time necessary to prepare the budgets by 80%.
Wow.
So that was actually the first use of personal computers in the Gap. I stayed active with the Atari community during that time, and we used File Manager the original version of File Manager as part of the application set that was in use at the Gap. And so I met up with the folks at Synapse at one of the users group meetings. I met John Lovelace and Ihor and Ken Grant there. And eventually I left the Gap to join Synapse to start up an applications development division. We were going to develop the next version of File Manager and then a spreadsheet statistical analysis and graphing program, and looked into doing a couple of other applications as part of that. So I joined Synapse probably about 1982, and initially I was doing sales management with John Lovelace, and then started up the applications division, and that led eventually to SynCalc, SynFile, and SynTrend.
Wow. So you were a vice president of product development, is that right?
Yes, at that time for the applications division. So I didn't run the development for the entertainment side of things. Kelly was the one that was doing that. I can't remember Kelly's last name. Kelly Jones was running the game development side of things.
And you were more with the business stuff.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay. All right. Cool. So let's talk about that. I mean, SynCalc and SynTrend, obviously you were already pretty familiar with VisiCalc and things, so you knew what was needed in a spreadsheet. So did you drive features you needed, or what was your role as manager there?
So I handled all of the product specifications and UI design. So there's a very idiosyncratic way of typing things in VisiCalc to get them done, and I thought it could be done a lot more efficiently by using the function buttons that were available on the Atari keyboard. So we tried to make it as visual as possible. You could use the cursor keys to select cells very easily. We did some advanced things that included non-contiguous range select. We added a lot of additional formatting functions that just weren't available in that version of VisiCalc, and added some other advanced business functions to it. But in general, we basically made it a lot easier to use and faster. So I made a lot of presentations at the local users group as the product was being developed, kind of showing how quickly you could accomplish the same set of tasks in SynCalc versus VisiCalc.
Cool. And did it sell? Was it worth it?
Yeah, but they ended up being extremely successful. The products were attractive enough that Atari wanted to do an exclusive licensing and distribution agreement for the products. Mm-hmm. Kind of a first for them. And yes, they did eventually sell quite well, although Atari was being run by Trammell at the time, and they were practicing some rather predatory business practices and ended up putting the screws to us on the distribution. That's one of the factors that led to the sale of Synapse to Broderbund.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I heard that they you delivered product and they didn't pay for it, and that was maybe part of the beginning of the end there.
Yes, that was pretty much the case.
Yeah. But in the meantime, you did SynCalc and SynTrend and other.
SynFile.
Sorry?
And we did SynFile, which is the database manager.
Right.
Yes.
So tell me about anything, any stories or anything about the creation of those products. Were they done in-house or by
they were all
freelancers?
So SynTrend I did, and
you programmed it yourself?
SynCalc, yes.
Well,
yeah. And SynCalc was done by Mike Silva, who was an in-house programmer. And Mike was one of the members of the users group that used to meet at my place way back. And SynFile Plus was done by two guys out of Colorado, and it was written in Forth.
I hadn't known that you had programmed SynTrend, so let's talk about that. I mean, I assume it's all done in assembly language, or was that also in Forth?
No, actually, that was written in BASIC with assembly language supplemental routines. So some of the graphics primitives I actually did in assembler to speed things up, and the rest of the data entry side of things and user interface portions were done in BASIC.
Nice. And so why did you decide to do that yourself rather than having someone else do it?
Because I kind of like programming.
All right. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Cool. Nice. I just found an article that you wrote for Antic Magazine in 1983 called "Filling the Gap" about
I remember that.
Ataris at the Gap.
Yes.
It ends with Atari 400s will be used with custom-designed hardware to monitor and analyze customer traffic patterns in an effort to match scheduling to customer flow. Yeah,
I actually built this huge contraption that had multiple infrared sensors that could detect people walking into or out of stores. And I tied it to an Atari 400 so we could actually just get a sense of when people were coming into the store and leaving. It was the first traffic analysis that had ever been done at the Gap. There's some obvious problems with it. If two people walk in side by side, I can't count them necessarily accurately. But we got some general statistics about when people were coming in and out. Other weird things that I did with Ataris back then is one of the guys at the Gap had a side business where he had a bunch of large-scale printing presses. And one of the problems with manually programming the jobs at the front panel is that the webs would retract, and it causes not only a delay in processing the subsequent job, but is excessive wear on the machinery too, which is kind of expensive.
The webs would retract?
Yeah, and I don't remember exactly what portion of the press that is, but basically things would kind of reset to an idle stage.
Okay.
And they wanted to avoid that so they could keep the utilization up on the presses and wear them out less. So it was an RS-232 interface on the press, and I got a hold of the manual for that and figured out what the pinouts were and did a custom cable to plug into the I/O module. I don't remember the number of it, but I was able to write a program in BASIC so that the owner could enter a whole series of jobs for the press according to the specifications that the customer had. And the Atari 800 would then queue the jobs up and send them down through the serial interface sequentially so that the press was never idle. So we were driving a $150,000 press with a $400 personal computer.
Nice.
He ended up using that for years and years and years. It was really pretty funny.
Any other stories there before it all collapsed and you went to Broderbund?
Yeah, so I think it was a very early experience to explosive growth. I think we went from 15 people to 110 in a year.
Wow.
So a lot was happening. And it was a pretty exciting time. Ended up doing a little bit of everything. Went out on sales calls to try to get distribution for the products. Worked on the product design side of things. Did some coding, and when things really got tight, I was down in the warehouse doing shrink wrapping.
Wow. How big was the business product side of things versus the game side of things?
I don't really remember precisely. My guess is that in terms of total volume, it was probably about 20% of the total revenues. That's kind of a guess, but
the business stuff was?
My gut. Yeah, that's my gut feel.
Hmm.
It was significant.
All right, and then what?
So then Trammell didn't pay the bill, and that forced the sale of Synapse to Broderbund. And I took over running Synapse as a wholly owned subsidiary of Broderbund for probably, I think it was about a little over a year to a year and a half. Mm-hmm. And then we finished the consolidation to the Santa Fe facility, and I took over product acquisition for them, for Broderbund.
Okay. Your resume said Director of Product Development. Does that sound something?
Yeah, I was doing product acquisition and some aspects of development, but my recollection is that Ed Bernstein was actually Director of Product Development.
Okay, so you were more acquisition from outside sources?
I was in the acquisition and evaluation side of things.
Okay, so what did that mean on a day-to-day basis?
On a day-to-day basis, that means that products were being sent in for publishing, and I would have to take a look at it and see how well it fit within the marketing strategy for Broderbund and decide whether it was worth further development, acquisition, or a pass.
Can you give? I want to hear some examples of the stuff that was pass.
I don't really remember too much of the details. We would there were so many products that were being sent in. It was kind of a difficult process to weed through them all, and I really don't remember too much about what we got passed through for publishing. I think I did that function for about 8 months or so before leaving to start Forte and do the new print shop for Broderbund.
Mm-hmm. Cool. I assume you were sent lots of games that were not very interesting and things like that were probably completely forgettable.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. There were a lot of things where I'm not quite sure what segment of the market would find this to be entertaining. I just remember the emotion. I don't remember the actual product that we were looking at.
Sure.
But there were quite a few laughs at looking at stuff.
So you eventually you left to start Forte, where you guys developed the new print shop. Why did you leave Broderbund? I've always wanted to know what it would be like to start and run a company. And this seemed like the opportunity to do it. So Mike Silva and I left to start a company and actually try to do development on our own. So this was the opportunity to test the waters in entrepreneurship. And we secured a development agreement with Pixelite to do the next version of Print Shop. And they, in turn, had the publishing arrangement with Broderbund. Cool. Actually, before we get there, I want to go back to Broderbund for a second. Are there anything that you, as director of acquisition, that you brought in that that you remember bringing in that was either a huge win or not? I mean, just what did you find?
I don't know that I can remember the details of any of the products at this point. I think the one. So there was a company, Kotobuki, in Japan that was developing Nintendo titles, and I don't remember exactly how I struck up that relationship with them, but I ended up writing the American instruction manuals for, I don't know, probably a dozen and a half Nintendo titles for them. But they had also licensed one of their titles to they had licensed one of the Synapse titles for publishing on the Nintendo in Japan. And I remember one time that my contact came over with the initial payment for the licensing agreement, and he was extremely apologetic because the bank had given him, I think it was $30,000 in cash as opposed to a check, and he had nervously sat. He was too afraid to ask them to not give cash and to give him the check that he originally requested. It would offend the bank teller. So he sat nervously with $30,000 in stacked bound $100 bills in his jacket pockets for the entire flight over from Japan, and he said he just could not fall asleep because he was worried that somebody would take some of the money.
Wow.
And I remember him coming up with this paper sack full of $100 bills. And I walked into the accounting office at Broderbund and to the accounting clerk there and dumped it out on the table. And I said, Mr. Ishii would politely request a receipt for these funds.
Wow. Yeah, you couldn't. I don't think it would be cool to fly internationally holding that much cash anymore. I don't think they let.
No. Well, even then, at that time, that was an awful lot of money.
Right. Yeah.
And it was really pretty funny. So I still stay in touch with Mr. Ishii, and we always have a good laugh about that one.
Nice. All right, so now you're at Forte, and you're doing new print shop, and we're kind of getting out of the Atari realm now, but that was a huge hit, wasn't it?
Yes, that was absolutely the largest, most successful product that I was involved with. It was a very long and arduous development cycle. I did all of the design work and I did all of the design work and some of the programming for that product on the IBM PC version, and then managed the development of and design of the other versions for Apple II and Commodore 64.
And no Atari version.
And that was actually the last. That was the last product development thing I ever did.
Cool. So, any idea why no Atari version there?
At that time, it looked like the Atari was ebbing, and we were trying to pick up the developing markets. The Commodore 64 was kind of a last gasp for that marketplace. We kind of expected the Apple II and the IBM PC in particular would be the versions that would sell the best. That's where we put the effort.
All right. I understand.
And honestly, it wasn't really our decision. We did this as a development contract to Pixelite, and they pretty much dictated which versions they wanted us to do.
Okay. What do you do today?
So Forte continued from that point until it still exists today as an IT consulting company. So when we started developing the new print shop, we needed a development network and set of systems to do. So I built that from scratch, and then started doing network installations for small businesses for accounting purposes with the CPA firm that we were with. And that's basically just continued to today. So Forte currently is a 21-person company delivering IT solutions to companies throughout the Bay Area. I just sold the company in May of this year, and after nearly 31 years.
Wow.
And I'm still working part-time for the resulting company, doing some high-level consulting projects and some network engineering things.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's part of the reason it took so long to get this interview is when I first contacted you, where you were just like, I'm selling my company right now. I cannot talk.
Yeah. Yeah, that was I've been trying to find a way to segue out, but in a way that allows the group to continue forward. And it's taken me about 10 years to kind of find the right person and right situation for them to move forward. And I'm happy that the whole group is intact and moving forward, because many of the people that are in the company have been working with me for more than 20 years.
Well, great. Congratulations.
Thank you.
What haven't I asked you about the Atari years that I should have?
I don't know if there's anything in particular. It was a really neat time because things were moving so rapidly. I think that was part of what was so exciting about it. I still have my Atari 800 set up here.
Nice.
And every once in a while, my wife and I will hook it up to a TV and pull out some of the old games that we used to play. It still has, a certain appeal to it.
Nice. What games do you play?
So my wife is an absolute demon on Crossfire, and I am horrible at it, but I don't know how she manages to do it, but she can play a single game on Crossfire for hours on end. And she only stops because she's tired, not because she's lost lives. She's just invulnerable in that game, and I can't explain it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Nice. Any chance you still have any discs, perhaps with the SynTrend source code or anything?
Oh yeah, I do. And so every product that I was involved with, I have one unopened shrink-wrapped copy for posterity.
Nice. Very cool.
So yeah, I still have the SynTrend product in a sealed box.
That's awesome.
I don't know that I have the source code anymore, but I do have the final product as kind of a last trophy piece.
Oh, that's really cool. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure how important the source code is because you said it was primarily in BASIC, but if there's
right.
Anyway, if you find anything that hasn't been, wasn't released publicly or any source code or anything, I'm happy to help you get that off the old media.
Okay.
Last question, I think. If you could send a message to the Atari 8-bit community that still exists, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
I don't know. I was actually surprised to hear from you and to know that there still is a somewhat active Atari community out there. It was a fun time, and certainly was the stepping stone to what I do now. It was a great opportunity to turn a hobby into a living, and I was really happy to kind of live that adventure.
Thank you, Brian.
You're most welcome.
If you enjoyed these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.